He is partner and co-founder of Diversity Media LLC, headquartered in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And he is responsible for editorial direction and philosophy of the magazine Diversity, Inc. and its website. He also oversees marketing and circulation for the publication, which was founded in 1998. A recognized leader in the field of business benefits of diversity to corporations, business groups, and nonprofit organizations. He appears regularly on CNBC, MSNBC, and Fox, and is often quoted in the premier publications of this country. The holder of a BS degree in biology from Rutgers University, he is a prolific volunteer. He is a trustee for Bennett College for Women, a member of the U.S. Navy Diversity Senior Advisory Group, a member of the steering committee for the Rainbow Push Wall Street Project, and that's just a few of the things that he's involved in. He was awarded the 2006 Bridge Builders Award from the Reverend Jesse Jackson last year, and was recipient of the Legacy of Leadership Award from Spelman College's Institute of Leadership and Civic Engagement. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our keynote speaker, Mr. Luke Visconti.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Well, Bernie Foster built a bridge by asking me to speak at this event. A white publisher invited by a black publisher to talk to an audience about Martin Luther King. It's quite an honor, and it's a real privilege to be here. Thank you very much. Bernie and I met at another event where I was discussing the business case for diversity. That the business case for diversity is a reality is due directly to Dr. King and the Civil Rights era. The business case for diversity is based on two factors: changing demographics of our country and the corresponding changes in economic power. In Dr. King's time, there were roughly 9 white people for every 1 person of color. 9 white people for every 1 person of color. Immigration had ended in the 1920s and would not resume until the mid-60s with the Immigration Reform Act. So our racial demographics were very stable in our country, and African Americans were the largest group, the largest segment of people of color. For African Americans, there was almost no access to college, almost no access to banking facilities, almost no access to corporate America, and most African Americans in 1960 could not vote in this country, legally could not vote. It's difficult to think back on that and find it a reality. Today, we live in an era of more immigration per capita than ever in the history of the United States, including the great wave of European immigration over 100 years ago. For Americans under 40 years old, there's less than 1.5 white people for every 1 person of color. For children under 10, the ratio is almost 1 to 1. When you think about it, that's a profound change. And where it's going is that white people are going to be the minority, I estimate, by 2040. The census says 2050, but I think it's going to be before that if you look at birth rates and immigration rate. There's just, it's 2040, I think, will be the tipping point. What's going on with that, aside from a change in demographics, is also a change in economic status for people. People of color are increasing their educational attainment quicker than their rise as a percent of the population. So if you understand what that means, people of color are getting graduate degrees, college graduate degrees, and postgraduate degrees more rapidly than they're increasing as a portion of our population. That's very good for our country, because correspondingly educated people make more money, and they tend to have children who become educated. And indeed, households of color are increasing their household income at more than double the rate of white households, and have been doing so since 1990. When you factor the things together, the change in demographics and the rise in education, households of color represent an 8-fold growth market compared to white households in this country. 8-fold. This has caused a group of companies in our country to take notice and become more progressive. My company runs a competition once a year to determine the Diversity Inc. Top 50 Companies for Diversity. This year, we received over 600 requests for the survey, and we expect over 350 companies to compete. Participation's up over 100% from just 3 years ago, and it's a very difficult survey, which is why you don't get a lot of companies request a survey, they look at it, and they say, well, we can't even get this information. So they look and do it for the next year. We ask over 230 questions on 4 areas: CEO commitment, human capital, corporate communications, and supplier diversity. Just so you know, there's no business connection between this list and my company. In fact, the #1 company for diversity, Verizon, in the 2006 list contributes less than 1/4% of my company's total revenue. Now, I'm responsible for editorial functions. My business partner is responsible for ad sales, and I remind them of that fact every morning. But there's no connection. There's no connection between business and the list. What I think you'll find is that the list is pretty remarkable. There's a lot of companies out there that are legends in their own minds on this subject. Well, it's true. But let's take a look at what our top 50 companies do. They employ 5% of the workforce, but they employ 17% of college-educated people of color. It's a big difference. They hire 43% people of color. This would be for the year 2005. The top 50 companies averaged 43% people of color. And there's a list, and everybody's going to get a copy of the magazine. There's a list of the top 50 in the magazine, and if you go to the website, you can look at the list for free. But I want to point out that the companies range from everything from Verizon to Abbott Labs to Marriott to Sodexo. So there's knowledge worker companies and there's labor-intensive companies. They all are able to accomplish 43% people of color being hired. Now, there's only 28% people of color in the workforce. So when you think about that accomplishment, it's pretty remarkable. They spend 7.5% of their procurement budget on minority and women business enterprises. We estimate the total percentage of spend on W and MBEs to be 2% nationwide. And I call that supplier diversity by mistake. So these companies actually do a very good job at managing their procurement to ensure that they're growing their own marketplace. Perhaps the most important factor that we look at is we turn our top 50 list into a stock index every year. The Diversity Inc. Top 50 is expressed as a stock index, outperforms the Dow Jones Industrial Average, the NASDAQ, and the S&P 500, which is pretty remarkable. Barron said that the average CEO has 18 months to turn around a stock price. And this small group of companies, this 42 publicly traded companies, outperforms indexes selected for financial performance. Now, this doesn't tell you that diversity is driving stock price. It's not. What this tells you, however, is that diversity management, robust, vigorous diversity management, is a cornerstone in superior corporate governance, and that's what returns on investment for their investors. Companies that have diversity in their DNA are going to bounce their competitors which do not. And what's kind of interesting about this is their competitors are likely to not even know what hit them. Now, despite all of this, despite everything that I've said, 80% of Fortune 1000 companies don't practice diversity management. And by diversity management, I don't mean Mexican food in the cafeteria on May 5th. One of the top practices in diversity I'm just getting warmed up. One of the top practices for diversity management is that the top executives, the direct reports to the CEO in the top 10 companies for diversity, have either 15 or 20% of their bonus attached to diversity achievement. And in the better companies, 70% or less of those executives actually get the bonus. In the most remarkable turnaround case I've ever seen, which is Walmart, which bounced back from some pretty substantial problems, they actually publicize the executives who don't make their list. And Lee Scott volunteered to take a significant portion of his bonus, which is multiple 7 figures, as being able to accomplish his company's diversity goals. So he's taking it on the chin as the leader if he doesn't accomplish his numbers. That's real diversity management. Okay. So why wouldn't all companies be doing this? Well, there's a reason. Most companies are run by straight, able-bodied white men. The luxury of being in the majority culture is never ever having to think about race. And that's how I came to the table, by the way. I was in the Navy, I was a recruiter, and a black pilot, another helicopter pilot just like me, same rank, took me under his wing, Tony Cato's his name, and explained to me what I was missing. And at first I said, oh, come on, Tony, you must be imagining this, or it's just it's not really happening, or it's a limited example. But then I realized, hey, Luke, what's the matter with you? You're denying the man his own reality. And here's a guy who's a helicopter pilot just like you, and you got to accept what he's seeing. Most white people don't see it, and they never even think about it, and it's something to think about. Now, that doesn't make all white people bad. Some of my best friends are white, and they're okay. But being in the majority makes you oblivious to a lot of the things going on around you, and we white people miss a lot of opportunities because of that. And I'll give you an example. The median worth of household worth of a black household is 1/10 that of a white household, 1/10. And at the current rate of closure, it's going to take 1,000 years for the median household wealth of black households to catch up to white households. Now, if you caught black households up to the median household wealth of white households, it would be like injecting the entire gross domestic product of the country of Japan into our economy, $4 trillion, right? How many office buildings could we have built? How many schools? How many cars? How many plasma TVs? How many things could we have built with all of that capital injected into our economy? So, who's being hurt the most by not having this happen? By not having a program to speed things up? It's kind of interesting. White people. There's more white people than anybody else. They would manufacture all of those great things that would be consumed by the injection of all that capital into our economy. So you could see that we all have counterproductive human tendencies. And one of them is, I call it the zero-sum game. It's a tendency for all of us to feel that if one group gets something, we're going to lose something. And it works, if you think about our DNA and where this all came from. When we were back in the bush and we were hunting antelope with a spear and running around on our loincloths, if the other tribe got the antelope, we went hungry. Or if the other tribe got to the berry bush first, we didn't have any berries to eat. So there's good reasons for us to have this common human failure. But as you can see, it doesn't work in an economic model. We just got to get over ourselves. There's a lot of things that we have to learn about ourselves. There's another reason for a lack of progress. People will do a lot to avoid feeling guilty. To look at our society and affect programs to build an equitable situation would cause us white people to really look at ourselves more clearly. Now, Dr. King did just that. He had students arrested. He had mass groups of people being arrested. He filled jails throughout the South. He made Bull Connor look like the anti-American that he was. He forced George Wallace to have to get on the phone with JFK so that JFK can nationalize the Alabama National Guard to allow 2 students to matriculate into the University of Alabama. So there is ways of making people confront the dirty reality of the situation that they exist in and change for the better. It's difficult to do. We don't have a Dr. King right now. Let's look more closely at the cost of disparities. If you believe that all people are created equal, then you have to assume that talent is also distributed equally. Unfortunately, we could tell by graduation rates that a vastly disproportionate percent of the black and brown talent in this country is dashed on the rocks of poorly funded public schools. Now, we could fix this. A country that has more than a dozen aircraft carriers and ballistic missile submarines and all sorts of things and satellites could fix this, but it would require a lot of money, wouldn't it? Well, in August of 1963, Dr. King made his I Have a Dream speech. He spoke first of our country's obligation to live up to the promises made by our founders that, quote, Black men as well as white men would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He spoke of a check that had been returned to people of color marked insufficient funds. He did that before he got to the often taken out of context parts like, my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, which, by the way, Michael Eric Dyson wrote a book and suggested that speech be retired for 10 years for being so abused by people who would tell us we're in a colorblind society. Well, the I Have a Dream speech isn't about colorblind. It's about the obligation that has to be paid before our society can move forward together. The check still hasn't cleared. Have we cashed other checks? Is it worth it to pay this long overdue bill? Or should we continue to ignore the knocking at our door? Let's look to history for an example. Following World War II in Korea, millions of veterans went to college free on the GI Bill, for free. Due to poor implementation of this program, white veterans disproportionately benefited. And by the way, I could suggest a book to you. It's called When Affirmative Action Was White, and it dissects every program from the Great Society on back to the New Deal and shows how Southern legislators, through the rubric of states' rights, perverted the intent of every social justice program ever conceived by the government, and the GI Bill was just one of them. So let's focus on white veterans. Before World War II, less than 7% of white people went to college, less than 7%. Today, 44% of white people go to college. It's a big difference. Our country's workers went from agrarian, farm working, and industrial or assembly work to knowledge worker work. The corresponding generation of wealth by people living up to the true extent of their potential through education created more wealth in a shorter period of time than ever in the history of human beings. Think about that. So is it worth making the investment? I think you could make the case that the $4 trillion missing in black household wealth is a drop in the bucket compared to what we're sacrificing to maintain a society of them and us. This is where it gets scary for our country. White people will be the minority by 2040. However, 75% of the planet's already not white. The elimination of information barriers, most notably the internet, and I'm going to give you a quick statistic. 3 years ago, there were 10 billion emails sent worldwide a year. This year, 30 billion emails were sent worldwide a year, and next year, IDG estimates there will be 60 billion emails sent worldwide a year. Now, I'm going to get 55 billion of them, so that'll leave 5 billion for the rest of you. But you can kind of see where the thing is going. The internet has liberated the talents of billions of people worldwide. The Chinese now have as many people who have access to the internet as we have citizens. They're building colleges and universities more rapidly than any other country on the face of the earth. People in India can call us on the telephone using voice over internet protocol for less money than it costs us to call them. So you think about it, there's another billion people who can call you for pennies. So you think about all of that talent. Now it can flow from wherever it is, it's been liberated, to wherever it's going to be best treated. There's 6 billion people on the planet and only 300 million Americans. Unleashing the talent of formerly oppressed Americans has made our market robust. As the world's formerly oppressed people have been able to exercise the talent they've been born with, the global economy is surging. Investors in this country have already figured it out. I couldn't believe this, but I actually read this over the weekend. 90% of all inflows to mutual funds in 2006 went offshore. 90%. So our own investors, the most wealthy people, are investing in international funds because they see where the market's going. By nonviolent protest, Dr. King forced our federal government to action in the 60s. I don't think you could say that Washington is any more visionary today than it was in that time. Sorry, Senator. Last June, my magazine ran a story in our top 50 companies for diversity issue, the June issue, which is a nice big fat issue, that was titled, the skyline headline across the top of the front cover, it was titled, The Worst Company for Diversity, the United States Senate. We described we described the almost total lack of diversity in key Senate staff positions. In that article, we ran a photograph of the Alito hearings for the Supreme Court. There were roughly 300 people in the photograph. You could not see a black face. Not a single one. There was not a single African American in the room that you could see out of 300 people deciding the next potentially 20 years on the top court. Now, there's nobody to sit there and whisper in the white senator's ear, hey, Senator, ask him this, or did you think about that? Just like Tony Cato did to me, there was nobody there in that room to do to the senators who were questioning Justice Alito. In this environment of malignant neglect, there's a new effort in this country to enter a new era of oppression. Bigots like Linda Chavez, Roger Klieg of the Center for Equal Opportunity, and poor souls like Ward Connolly. What went wrong with that poor man? I don't know. They are actively working against affirmative action. They are telling us that we should be colorblind, that all things are created equal and affirmative action is wrong. They have worked to end affirmative action in California, Texas, and Florida, and most recently, they got an initiative passed in Michigan, which was disturbingly named the Civil Rights Initiative, which ended affirmative action. Their arguments, and we have an article coming up on this. I actually have Roger Klieg's arguments on my laptop off to the side where I can keep an eye on them. But the arguments are basically that it's a colorblind society, we don't need to do this, and it's wrong to do this. They are aggressively attacking, and you have to understand, Linda Chavez's group had offices in South Africa supporting apartheid. I'm not kidding. Look it up. Find out what her sources of income are. Look at her website. She doesn't tell you. We'll tell you. We got an article coming up. We're doing a whole map of where the money's coming from. Very interesting. You'll know who to do business with. Okay? So their arguments disregard the lasting effects of racism. They disregard the 1/10 wealth. They disregard the obvious disparities of our country. And the fact is, we don't have a colorblind society. It takes the blinders of the majority or the deception of evil people to not deal with the obvious. The obvious is that a colorblind society would not have more segregation in public schools today than ever before in our history. There's schools named for Thurgood Marshall that are almost 100% black. I'm sure he's spinning in his grave. A colorblind society would not foster a prison industrial complex and incarcerate people disproportionately by race. Our country has a new record. We incarcerate more people per thousand than the former record holder, the Soviet Union. A colorblind society would have rebuilt New Orleans by now. A colorblind society would understand that not having universal health care is equivalent to wealth redistribution from poor people to wealthy people. A colorblind society would have 50% women senators and roughly 28% senators who are people of color. A colorblind society would have equal partner rights for both straight people and gay people. A colorblind society would keep track of Iraqi civilian deaths as carefully as we're keeping track of our own soldiers' deaths. A colorblind society with the mightiest military on the planet wouldn't stand by as 2 million people are herded to their death in Darfur. A colorblind society would understand that unalienable rights are not limited in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence for people who have the right documents. They're for everybody. A colorblind society would not allow admissions to public colleges to be determined by tests which have different results by race, like the SATs. And finally, a colorblind society would have an equal chance of a white publisher be inviting a black publisher to speak about America. Ward Connolly and Linda Chavez are well-funded and working nationwide. They've attacked affirmative action at the state level and attacked diversity programs at the corporate and university levels. By the way, every university but the University of Toledo folded like a cheap camera as soon as they got the letter from them. I want you to know that. Investigate your own schools. Great schools like Princeton couldn't wait to throw in the towel. Go think about that. Okay, now, we've got to be aware, right? Dr. King told us that we have the obligation to forthrightly address practices that preserve racism. We also have the obligation to act. Vote your ethics. Most eligible people of color either are not registered or do not vote. The last congressional election was swung by Latino voters who went from Republican to Democrat, and I'm pretty sure it had something to do with that preposterous 700-mile fence. The reality is that your elected officials look at who votes, and they portion their attention accordingly. Be careful about who you do business with and work for. Reward companies that share your vision. Understand who's working on your behalf and go work for them. Become financially literate. Build your family wealth through home ownership. In closing, I want to say that I think that Dr. King brought our country closer to its true potential of our Constitution more than any other American. More than any other American. In fact, he was recently named by the readers of the Atlantic magazine as the #4th most influential American of all time. I think that he would point out that because our country is not making sure that liberty is equally enabled, we continue to make mistakes domestically and worldwide. If our country doesn't move past a white-centric model, the math tells me that we're shorting our potential and trading the world's best Constitution and our children's future for the fool's gold of bigotry. So thank you for your attention today, and thank you for the kind reception. It was my pleasure to spend Dr. King's Day with you in such a meaningful way. Thank you very much.